Hi, I'm Kat.
And I'm Gabe.
And we're
the Ghouls Next Door. And we are finishing up our representation series, at least for right now.
No, it's never done.
No, our work is never done. And I have no doubt that we'll either recover these subjects later and cover some more, because there's a lot of populations that are represented in horror, not always to the best of our abilities.
Yeah.
And for lots of reasons. But today we are kind of finishing up and wrapping this up with one last episode, one last hurrah for this. And we are talking specifically about Eastern Asian representation in horror. And we've invited Rob Buscher of the Philadelphia Asian American Film Festival. Did I say your last name right?
It's Buscher, but
Buscher.
Close enough.
What did I say? Buscher. Why don't you tell our listeners a little bit about yourself and why they should listen to you?
So I'm a mixed-race Japanese-American. My family came here from Japan in the 1920s. I'm a fourth-generation American, and we've got a long history here as a community, as a peoples. Although I think based on what you see typically in mainstream media, television, and films, you are led to believe oftentimes that Asians only exist as immigrants with heavily accented tropes and stereotypes. So I think it's important, to kind of think about who this community is over the long history of time that people have been here in this country. I run the Asian American Film Festival here in Philadelphia. I've been the festival director now for 6 years, been involved with the festival for 7 since 2013, and I come at it from a programming background. So I spend a lot of time watching and curating films. Mm-hmm. I'm also an avid horror fan.
Yay! Oh. Yes. If that name sounded familiar to you, it's because we kind of fangirled over Rob in a earlier episode when we talked about our foreign horror in Japan episode, where we found the most very convenient article, just like through circumstance, where it was about Japanese horror and like the history of that. And I was like, this is awesome. And then I saw the name and I was like, wait a second, I know this person. It was kind of just cool to see and to know. And then I was like, oh, and I totally trust this resource because I know you're familiar. Like I was familiar with you because of the Asian American Film Festival here in Philadelphia. So I was like, this is perfect. And so today we're going to talk about specifically Eastern Asian representation, right? So we didn't want to cast this really broad net on a lot of different peoples who are usually categorized under this like Asian representation, because I just don't feel like that does a justice to all of the different niche populations in there and their experiences. Kind of like when we talked about Latinx, we were being very specific, and that's not to say that we won't in the future cover specific countries the way that we've done with Japan. We have plans to do so, and also like to cover certain areas in there as well and what their lives are about. But we're going to dive into Eastern Asian representation in horror, where we will talk about the AMC TV show The Terror, but season 2. Don't do what we did and accidentally watch season 1. We will talk about season 2 and we'll explain why.
We're like, maybe eventually something happens.
I was like, this is too long in time period for there ever to be an overlap. I was like, this is way too far in the past for there to be like a good overlap in any way. We'll explain. You'll see.
Facts. Yeah, facts. We tell you facts. All the facts. Yeah, facts. Still facts. About that spooky stuff. Yeah, spooky stuff.
Okay, so we are talking about Eastern Asian representation. I wanted to kind of dive in a way, because there's a lot of threads that we keep seeing, a lot of tropes and characters that are kind of the same throughout like the different minorities, right? So it's like we all serve this one purpose, and they just kind of swap out for a new minority. It's like, oh, it's your turn to be this character. It's your turn to be that. Or even to see kind of like a comparison to some of the tropes and how they change between minorities. So one thing I was like thinking about is Ariel in our Black Women in Horror episode talked about like the fetishism of the Black woman and how there's like this dichotomous like she is, dangerous because she's like gorgeous and exotic, but it's like she's also a temptress, like she's gonna corrupt you, right? And that kind of trend is also seen for Eastern Asian women, where they are seen as like, but instead of being like the aggressive temptress that we see with Black women, they're more of like the timid one that's just waiting, right? But they're like secretly the poisonous one. Like they're usually like represented like as like a dragon or a snake. But there's also like the kind of dangerous dragon lady for the older like East Asian women, who are like the ones who are like demanding and telling you what to do, versus like the young and like timid and like all that. And it's just a weird fantasy for, I guess, like the white protagonist that we have on screen. And then even that versus what we're seeing with the way that like East Asian men are represented, where they're not even allowed to like be the protagonist or be the sex symbol, because they were like a direct threat to the workforce of the white men at the time.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much there in terms of gender politics and masculine and feminine sexuality. Every time that you see historically Asian women on screen, it's as kind of submissive, docile, sexually available, or in other cases, hypersexualized women who are actively prostituting themselves. Unfortunately, it comes from a long history of American military presence in Asia.
That makes sense.
And the unfortunate reality is that there's quite a bit of prostitution in really all military occupations. But considering the history of the United States and the Philippines, colonizing, annexing the Philippines as a territory from 1898, looking at the history of the occupation of Japan post-World War II, of course, Vietnam and the time that people were there in Southeast Asia, obviously the Korean War as well. And the fact that there's still a military presence in all of those regions from the United States has led to this kind of generation-wide understanding that Asian women can be bought and sold as a sexual commodity. And it's something that we see time and time again within popular culture.
Yeah, and it's such a weird, like, when you think about like the history behind like our fetishism of these specific women, and even something that Kat is going to touch on later is even like when there was a Asian woman who was going to be in a film, that they couldn't have a white man star alongside her, so that would limit the Asian woman's ability to even be on screen, because of course that white man's going to come first. Like, you're just here. And then even just thinking in some things we're going to talk about with the like Japanese internment camps, like during that turmoil in time, it was even harder to like get any type of representation on screen and it not be, whitewashed with some
Or just horribly offensive and used as like a tool to create fear, or just like maybe the like lack there, like trying to make it a comedy character who is non-threatening. So obviously we can do whatever we want with
the caricatures, like essentially all those like pamphlets and horrible imagery that we are seeing, and similar to how how Black people were represented in like with the big red lips and the crazy blackface, right? We had like the opposite for the way that we were seeing Chinese people in like California, because they were like, these are our enemies, so we have to like cartoonize them. And then they just further did that with like white people's faces by cartoonizing. Is that a word? Cartoonize.
I don't know if that's a word.
Caricatures.
Caricatures.
Right? There you go.
They made them caricatures. There's a big problem with whitewashing, right? So thinking about Ghost in the Shell or Dragon Ball in current days, but Avatar. Even Avatar, like really.
And that came from Shyamalan.
Yeah, like what
South
are you
Asian
doing?
Dude. Come on, man.
You have like why? Yeah, but even thinking like back to Bela Lugosi and Boris Karloff's Mr. Wong, the detective series. Like Bela Lugosi, and we've talked about both of these gentlemen, but Bela has a very strong Hungarian accent, and they didn't even pretend to like get rid of, like they didn't school him to not even do that. Like, versus, which is just like blatant, like, we don't care, right? To something that's like incredibly cringy, like Mickey Rooney,
Right.
which is just like very yikes, from, was it Breakfast at Tiffany's?
Tiffany's,
Oh my
yeah.
God, so bad. So like you see those things and they're very cringy, but then we're still seeing those, right? So we still have like Emma Stone playing people she shouldn't be playing. We got Scarlett Johansson. We got Peter Sellers, who's done it more than once, in different things. We have the entire cast of Cloud Atlas, who just decided an entire plot line was where we all just like did a horrible thing, and it's like, why did you do that?
That was like a decade ago.
Yeah.
Right? Well, it's amazing too, I think, like how yellowface is something that we still see even today to some extent, along with brownface, right? The costuming of South Asian American individuals by non-South Asian people. The most recent stuff that we've seen, like think about Mad TV, right? Miss Swan, that character was played by a white comedian for like a decade on primetime television. In 2013, I think there was a Pop Chips commercial that Ashton Kutcher was in, where he was Raj, the Bollywood producer, in like full-on brown face and a really awful accent. But that stuff is kind of amazing to me, because when we think about the broader implications on society, if someone was to do blackface like openly, I mean, they wouldn't be working.
Yeah.
But at the same time, like there's still these like major figures within Hollywood who have broadly done this kind of stuff. It's also kind of frustrating. You mentioned Emma Stone, right? Yeah. I mean, in that film, Aloha, like it's shot on location in Hawaii, which is like the capital of mixed race Asian people.
Yeah.
You're telling me they couldn't find a single person,
Nope.
a single Hapa girl like on the island that could have played it better?
Yeah.
And I just can't believe that.
Yeah.
But actually, you had mentioned too Boris Karloff, right? And it's interesting to think about him, that role of Mr. Wong. He's playing a Chinese detective in that, right? And so he was actually a hero.
Yeah.
And those, as offensive as those stereotypes are, and the fact, of course, that they were being played by white actors most of the time, also being very offensive, were actually meant to counter the Chinese villain trope, right? And so, like Fu Manchu, like specifically, they were looking at this kind of dichotomy between people like Charlie Chan or Detective Wong, and then Fu Manchu being like the Oriental evil. You can't see my fingers, but I'm doing scare quotes here.
Yeah.
And it's this kind of interesting thing where like Karloff made his career out of these movie monsters, right?
Yeah.
And even well into the 80s, they would rerun the Fu Manchu films with him playing in yellowface in these movie monster double or triple bills.
Yeah.
And it's odd, right? Because like when else have you seen like someone who's racialized as an evil other put in that same category as a movie monster?
We also have a trope that we keep seeing, which is this idea of like a magical like version of this minority, right? So we have the magical Negro trope. We do have like usually like magical like Native Americans or like indigenous people, right? And then we have magical like Asian people where it's like they know kung fu or martial arts. They are kind of like off-putting and strict, right? So like Mr. Miyagi, right?
Sure.
Who's just like here literally to give the tools to our protagonist so that they can go fight their battles, and then they're like done. And they're also kind of like inhuman in a way, like they're kind of like a superhero, but not enough of a superhero to be the protagonist.
It's funny though, because thinking about Mr. Miyagi specifically, my great grandfather was a judo sensei, and like he was pretty close to Mr. Miyagi in a lot of ways, right? So like there are certain things that are stereotypes, that are tropes, that are based in fact, but it's also, the problem is that for so long there's been this kind of scarcity of representation. So every time that you get that one role, it's got to speak for thousands of people.
Yeah.
Whereas a white person, for example, doesn't have that same crisis when it's like, here's a serial killer that's on screen, but then there's like a dozen romantic comedies that come out the same weekend starring white people, or like an action film who's also the hero is a white person.
Yeah, or even if it is a serial killer film, like our protagonist is also a white person, right? So it's like we can see very clearly on the same screen two different types of people who are both white, and like so we're like, oh, look at all the options we have, but it's like, no, you have to fit this one specific role. These are what you're written in as, and it's like either you're like the geisha that we're like mooning over, or you're like the kung fu master who's literally just here to like teach this kid to fight his own battles. there's this, what I found was interesting, and I was thinking about it, was the idea that like the future is very Asian in the way that people are looking at it. So like when you think of like Blade Runner.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? Like it's like very like it has a lot of that influence, but at the same time there's very little representation of like Asian people in this environment. Especially I have not watched, was it 2049 is the new one? Blade Runner, some like whatever it was, which has even less specific representation of anyone who's not white, right? So it's just like, how do we have all this influence, which makes sense because that's like the majority of like the world's population. So of course they would have an influence, and specifically like in the future world that we're seeing, where they're speaking Mandarin in Firefly, right? But to simultaneously like just take their culture, but then completely erase them from the imagery that we're seeing on screen as far as people are concerned.
I think the erasure aspect is interesting because for such a long time in this country's history, it was this kind of exclusion logic, you know, whereas like indigenous genocide and African slavery characterized these other immigrant and slave populations that the United States built the power structure and the economy on. Asians, for the most part, although they were also human labor capital, were excluded for as long as they could be. And that's a big part of the story even today when you kind of look at the media landscape. You're not seeing these people even when aspects of the culture are being appropriated directly, or it's just influencing these kinds of futurescapes that we see in a lot of science fiction films. I got much love for the Blade Runner universe, but you know, Ridley Scott is admittedly not the best when it comes to representation.
Yes.
I mean, he had a really unfortunate quote around I think it was the Gods of Egypt that he was doing.
Oh no, I don't know.
Where it was, what am I going to do? Cast Muhammad's who and such as so and so. And you know, it's just that kind of flippant attitude that like, who cares about diversity if it doesn't sell?
Yeah.
And unfortunately, that is the commercial reality, right? Like we're looking at a film industry. And so it's hard sometimes, you know, I get this a lot because like we're doing community work through this film festival, and it's really about trying to bring up a group of people who haven't seen themselves historically represented. But at the same time, like we have to be realistic that unless we're being able to create a market commodity, if we're not bringing in big box office returns, if we don't have the ratings on a TV show, we're not going to get cast again, or we're not going to get that next pilot greenlit. So it's this kind of commercial reality versus the actual good that we can do through this type of media. Yeah,
there was a quote that found, which talked about that specific thing.
So it is from Vice.com, specifically an article, Hollywood Doesn't Fully Represent Asian Americans Yet, by Bettina McCollenthal. But it was a quote from the writer of Crazy Ex-Girlfriend, Tess Perez. And essentially, she has a really great quote. Talented Filipina ex-actor friend of mine is meeting with new agents, and one just told him that Filipinos are a hard sell and that she couldn't do anything with that. And she tweeted about it saying, pursuing dreams is so hard, and I read stuff like this and I want to give up. But then I remember when I was little and I never saw anyone like me on TV or in film, and it made me feel like we didn't exist. And I really, really want to be that person for someone, and I'm going to die trying.
And that's kind of like what we've been touching on in this whole series, is the importance of being represented on screen, and not just like being there, it's also the way that you're being presented, right? Because this is sometimes the only part that people can see, right? Like if we live in an environment, like here in Philly, we have a lot of different communities. I get to see all kinds of people and interact with them. But if you go outside of Philadelphia into any other place in Pennsylvania, if watching like TV is the only way that you're going to experience this different culture or know about these other peoples, it is very, very important that we are getting diversity, and we're seeing like heroes, and we're seeing different levels of people, not just like these same tropes, which then influence the way that we see an entire culture. And then also for those kids out there who might be living in those same places where they're the only family on the block that's a minority, and then they're not seeing themselves on TV.
Yeah, it feels the sense of otherness, that whole not seeing yourself on screen. If that's the only film you get, then that is the only understanding of what that group is. So if you have one film where you're Mr. Miyagi, and then everything else is just white people, white people, white people, you're not going to, feel like, oh, does everyone think I need to be Mr. Miyagi? Or like, what the heck? Like, where am I in this? And then if you don't see yourself, you feel like you don't exist.
You know, and I can hard relate to that because I grew up in a town of less than 20,000 people in rural suburban Connecticut, where my mom and sister were the only other Japanese Americans in that entire community. Like literally 3 other Asian families when we were growing up. So kind of trying to make sense of identity, it's a hard enough thing no matter who you are or where you're from. But then on top of that, you know, especially I grew up in like the early 90s, right? And so coming of age at a time when, you know, the best representations were things like Gere Watanabe as Long Duck Dong and 16 Candles. Or, you know, like Miss Swan coming on TV eventually and like people comparing her to my mother. So just trying to, you know, carve out a space so that this next generation doesn't have that scarcity that we did growing up. And it's happening, you know, and I think that we definitely see that happening, particularly in the television space.
Yeah, I was going to say, we are making some strides, right? Like, so we had Crazy Rich Asians, which has made a lot of money, which is great, and a lot of attention. We have Killing Eve with Sandra Oh, which is awesome. We have To All the Boys I Loved Before, which had made us cry and laugh. Awkwafina's The Farewell, which is getting a lot of really amazing reviews. Always Be My Maybe, Pen 15. There's Glenn in Walking Dead. There's John Cho as in The Exorcist TV series, starting, I think, season 2.
Yeah, you also have Fresh Off the Boat.
But I think people are starting to see that these are narratives that people enjoy, and that we can do that, right? Like, we can trust these stories to be told, and that they will make the money that the houses are looking for them to make.
Yeah, and I think that's, if nothing else, the great thing about the successes of both Black Panther and Crazy Rich Asians was that in the same year, like, Hollywood no longer had an excuse to say that a people of color-led film is not going to do well at the box office, because both of those smashed all kinds of records and expectations. Yeah. And, you know, ever since, there's been a lot more real authenticity in terms of the kinds of characters that people are being writ into, both on television and in films. But, you know, I think the one thing that I would caution people against is thinking that, you know, we're okay now, right? Because, we start to see some things happening, and there is change, there's a movement, but it doesn't happen overnight. And I think it's also important to remember that in a community as large as the Asian American and Pacific Islander community, obviously there's a lot of folks that are being left out of that conversation. You know, people who have been historically marginalized within this community that are still not getting to see their stories told.
I guess you kind of touched on this as we were going, right? But kind of what, you know, where your passion for, like, being involved in the film festival and helping these stories come out, like, where does that come from? And, like, and what do you get out of representing, like, and fostering representation?
So my great-grandmother, who was a first-generation Japanese immigrant, an Issei, as we would call. We count, like, the generations in Japanese. So I'm a Yonsei, 4. Nice. She's a Issei. She was. She lived until 2006. So I was in college by the time that she passed away. And very few people of my generation have the privilege of knowing their immigrant ancestors. So it kind of gave me and my sister a bit of a leg up, I think, in terms of understanding the importance of our heritage and also this direct lineage of what it meant to have folks who came from Japan, and then also weathering the crazy storm that was living in America as a Japanese American throughout the 20th century.
Yeah.
So the first and most important thing that I credit her for constantly is that I got to have an appreciation of Japanese cinema because of her. She loved film and television. She was a big fan of the jidaigeki, like period dramas that were on TV in Japan, and was constantly watching them. So anytime I would go visit her, then she would always have them on. And even though I didn't understand the language, I was just glued to the TV set because, you know, people who looked like my relatives were like fighting with samurai swords. I'm like, who doesn't want to watch that, right? But, you know, it was such stark contrast to the kinds of Asian representations that I would see from time to time on television, these kinds of, really infantilized men who had no sex appeal, were not sexually desirable. I mean, I was still too young to understand the implications of that, but I knew they weren't cool.
Yeah.
Right? Like, they were the nerds. They were the kids that got beaten up. They were the people who didn't get the girl. And that was not the case in the Japanese films that she showed me. So I got to have another perspective that otherwise I really might not have gotten living in the town that I grew up in. So ever since then, I've really been kind of fascinated by the differences in media culture. I spent a long time studying Japanese cinema, did a graduate program in Japanese cinema studies, and when I was living in the UK, co-founded the first Japanese film festival there.
Nice.
So it was something that I think was very personal in a lot of ways for me, and I didn't really have the vocabulary for it yet, but it was totally like identity driven, and I was just trying to understand like who I was as like a young person. I was in my early 20s, like living in the UK, having moved to England straight out of high school, and no idea like what it was to be Japanese American. I still kind of thought myself as Japanese until I lived in Japan and like realized that, oh, no, not Japanese either.
You're in that in between.
But it was kind of cool because like it really then having the opportunity to come here to Philly about a decade ago, like I got so integrated very quickly within the local community here because the work that I was doing, I was working for the Greater Philadelphia Film Office, local film commission, got to do some cool stuff in terms of on-location shoots from some of the bigger Hollywood studios that were shooting here in Philadelphia. Mm-hmm. But unfortunately, like 4 months after I moved here, the Tohoku earthquake happened. Oh. And so the triple disaster in Japan, the tsunami, the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear plant disaster, that happened, and I was just torn up because I didn't know what to do. I was so far away. I had friends and family that were kind of in the general vicinity of there. And, because I had a film background, I decided that I was going to try to put together a charity film festival. So we did a couple of film screenings earlier in the year, and then actually had a 4-day film festival with the proceeds going towards the Tohoku relief efforts. And that just kind of put me in touch with the community, and I got to spend more time getting to know who Japanese American community was, but then the broader Asian American community through the Asian American Film Festival. So doing this kind of work, it just is natural to me. It's part of this kind of extension, I think, of trying to understand who I was as a younger adult. Now I'm kind of like in my early 30s, and not obviously nobody has it figured out ever.
Yeah.
Right. But at this point, I'm comfortable with who I am, and I just want other people to be able to have that experience maybe a little easier than I did by having this access to a multitude of different perspectives and authentic representations of people that look like them.
Yeah.
From my college days, this is stuff I actually didn't write down, but I remembered as you were talking, I was like, oh my God, this would totally be a great thing to say. So I just remember over and over again when I was in college, just like hearing that Asian culture of Southeast Asian, South Asian, and East Asian has just such a long history. Longer and complex, more so than any white person has ever given credit for. And that like throughout history, there was just this big push to one, like minimalize that, to increase like the wonderfulness of Western Europe, and then also like to validate doing horrible things to India during colonization through Britain, and basically China, and like all the countries that exist in Asia that were doing a lot of stuff for a very long time in a very sophisticated and, different way than what was happening in Western Europe. And they would basically be like, no, this is bad. We have to make it seem more brutal. We have to make it seem more uncivilized in terms of our lens. And then stealing cultural things from there and being like, no, that wasn't happening. This is from us. Yeah. We have invented this. It just kind of goes back to this like whole long history of trying to like minimalize the wonderfulness and success and beautifulness of cultures that are different than whiteness.
And manipulating the lens in which we're viewing them too.
So like, as you were saying, basically having stories that take elements of the culture that they're trying to present, but not having anyone from that culture being actually the one representing it.
I mean, so much of that, I think, stems from this idea of Orientalism, right? Edward Said talks about that in his seminal text on post-colonial studies.
Yep.
But it's that idea that, the West is constantly fetishizing the East. And it's through that lens of the Orientalist that we have these tropes and stereotypes. So he was talking about folks from the Middle East, but it can just as easily be attributed to indigenous folks, to African folks, to people in South Asia and East Asia. So I think like so much of that, and unfortunately even anthropology kind of stems from that idea of kind of pseudoscientific rationalization of why it was okay for Europeans to be colonizing people.
Yeah.
Yeah. How that translates into film, which is some of the tropes that, we've been talking about. The reason we often would see white people portraying Asian people in films, especially like way back when the films were first starting, like silent films, and then even transcending past that, is partnered with like miscegenation laws. Yes. So it's basically where you could not portray any races that were different from each other, married, interacting together in a positive way. And like in film specifically, Luis Rayner, during the casting of The Good Earth, Pearl Buck's The Good Earth, was trying to get the lead role. And they were like, no. We want this white man to play this Asian character, or this Chinese specific character. So we can't cast you as this role because you cannot be on screen with this man. As we saw in The Terror, he was like, when he was with his girlfriend who was pregnant, he's like, but we're not married because we know that's not. She's just my girl. We're not married. And like seeing that and being like, oh my God, that's from The Thing, look, it's in the TV.
Stuff like that, right? The anti-miscegenation and anti-race mixing laws, that's all part of the Hays Code. So, from the 30s through the mid-50s, you got that like really tough clampdown, and from a time period that immediately before that, like the 1910s at least, tended to be fairly progressive in the United States. The 20s signals this decline into really conservatism, social conservatism, despite this kind of push and pull and the fighting around prohibition laws. People are fighting for the soul of America. It's not dislike, I guess, what's happening right now today. But I think very poignantly, looking at things that are as ridiculous as someone who is rather going to cast two people in yellowface than having one actor or actress that could be Asian because of this, law that doesn't even exist. It wasn't even a law. It was just this code that the Hollywood producers got together.
Those Hollywood producers.
Smart, and this is so cool.
Film. Yeah, films. We watch some films. Now let's talk about those films. And all that spooky stuff.
All right, so we watched some stuff as we do. Specifically, The Terror from 2018, created by Max Bronstein, Alexander Wu, and George Takei.
Takei. But he's consulting. He's not.
He's consulting.
But he's a consultant.
But he's great and should be talked about all the time.
Yes.
So essentially, the plot of this is supernatural, semi-historical horror anthology series, which each season is inspired by a different, infamous, or mysterious real-life historical tragedy. So historical fiction / based on real things that are made into fictional.
Yes.
Spooky times.
Yes.
Which is super fun. Season 2 specifically documents the history of the Japanese-American incarceration during World War II.
Yes. So it features these Japanese characters. So it's pretty much almost all Japanese characters, which is awesome. The few white characters that are prominent that I can think of, there's the one drunk boss guy who is clearly a villain, and then there is the friend who's in the military who's is he a villain? I don't know. And then we also have another main character who is a Hispanic woman, Luz. So it's like it's really interesting to see an entire majority of a cast being a race that is not white. And specifically it being Japanese on like AMC. Right? Like that doesn't happen.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's cool that none of them were good white people, too. Sometimes there's not always a good white person. Sometimes they're not.
It is kind of crazy, right, to just flip the channels and happen upon an episode of The Terror and everybody's speaking in Japanese.
Yeah.
And they're all played by Japanese or Japanese Americans. And it's just kind of a mind-blowing thing, I think, for the entire, like, nationwide Japanese American community, because for so many decades, like, there's been this stigma on being Japanese, right? And so, like, parts of Japanese culture are cool, and people like to cherry pick which ones are acceptable and which are not. But rule of thumb is that if you're a Japanese American practicing Japanese culture, it's not cool.
Yeah.
So it's nice to see something like this, and I sincerely hope that it might lead to some more progressive and inclusive conversations about that. Yeah,
and I think there's a lot of strengths for this that I was kind of like making mental note of. First, thank you so much for suggesting it. And I was just like, that was perfect. I think it's interesting because it is a horror show, because it is very spooky. There are parts in it that are scary. There's like the fidgety movements that really get people, which is also like that kind of like body movement twitch thing is also like kind of influenced from Japanese horror films too. So it's like awesome that that's in there. But then it's also like the fantastical kind of like stories that come from their history. But the real horror is very honestly like the situations that they're in, and like the fear that, like, you know, at any point they're just gonna turn on you. Like, they're totally ripped of all of their rights. They're sent from place to place. The dad is just taken like in the middle of the day, and we don't know where he is. And there's like a scene where he's just like, where did he go? And they just will not tell him. And it's like, how dare you even ask? And so there's all these like levels to that, like, and kind of paralleling it to what we see today. It's just like kind of further asserts that. And George has been quoted in this article. He said, "What we have is this endless cycle, the repetition of this kind of horror, injustice being inflicted on minority people. And we see it again today on our southern borders. But we've reached a new grotesque low. We were together with our parents. Our families were intact. What we see today now is this incredible inhumanity of children being torn away from their parents. I hope this show will remind people that it is still existing today. It is our hope that enough people, enough Americans seeing this, will try to keep this sort of thing from reoccurring in the future of this country to make it better, truer democracy." Which is literally what we were saying. So I think you do a good job, like, for anyone who's watching with their media analysis classes. And I think even if you're trying to be a passive viewer, it's hard to just look at this and just be like, oh, there's a spooky ghost that, you know, makes people kill themselves. And even not even understanding like what is it Yurei? Even if you don't understand what that is, you know, like, this is a bad thing, right? And even if you're like, that's scary, it's really, really hard to shut off what else is scary.
Yeah, and I think that's what the show captures so elegantly, right? Because there's so many things to be afraid of in that show. I mean, the idea that, one, you're being othered and singled out because you look like the enemy, right? And sharing the face or the ancestry of the same country that has just bombed Pearl Harbor. Terrifying, right? Or the fact that your father or husband could be plucked in the middle of the night and brought to some undisclosed location for unknown period of time without really any kind of safety net as to whether they'll come back at all. Or simply the fact that there's armed guards walking around inside of a prison camp that have guns pointed inwards from the watchtowers. You know, I think one of the common misconceptions about these camps is actually stemming from the words that we use to describe them, right? So, like, internment is actually not an accurate descriptor, right? Because according to the Geneva Conventions, internment is only enemy combatants or people of another nationality that are being segregated by the military. This is actually, by definition, a concentration camp because it is a concentrated group of minorities that are being isolated, 2/3 of whom were actually American-born citizens. So thinking about it from that perspective, man, that's a scary concept.
Yeah.
You know, it's something that I think is back then, as it is now, very familiar to the Japanese American community. And these are all the kinds of stuff that this show captures brilliantly, on top of obviously some great nods to a more traditional Japanese horror genre.
Yeah. What I thought was interesting is that it kind of like walks into the like Pearl Harbor. Like, it doesn't start there. It gets you kind of comfortable first, and you're just focused on like, this is a traditional story where they're like doing that, and you kind of know, but as soon as it happened, like, I was like, oh no, oh my gosh, I just remembered. Like, it was
Pearl Harbor happened.
I was like, this means so much. Like, and I was immediately like scared in a totally different way than I had been previously in that show, because it's like the first part of it really is like, there's this, person who's getting revenge, person in quotes, because I don't really know since we're watching it, right? Who's getting revenge in this supernatural way. So we're seeing that, and that's like already kind of cringy and like weird, because it like makes them put themselves in harm's way. So it's like this really weird, like unpredictable terror too. But then as soon as that came in, I was like, whoa, we have a whole new like horror to worry about, which I thought was really, really good in the like, because they could have just started us in there, but instead they were like, let's just walk us in there. And like, I think the main character Chester and his experiences are really, really interesting, in that like, he like this whole situation in this war is like this difference between being Japanese and American, but he is Japanese American, right? So he's like caught in this in between, and even like enlisting is like this really big deal where it's just like, what side is he on, and who's going to believe he's on any side, and why should he be on any side? Kind of like, I was like, wait, what is this bad? I was like, which part of this is bad? When I was watching, because it was just so conflicting to see him go through that.
Yeah, and I think that's the other part of the story that again echoes very true to life, is that, it must have been terrifying to be a soldier on any side of that war, let alone a Japanese American who was fighting an enemy that looked like them, and which was a very small minority of people, right? Because the most largest groups of Japanese Americans who enlisted were in the European front of the war. Over 20,000 Japanese Americans enlisted for the all Japanese American segregated regiment called the 442nd. But there was a smaller group called the Military Intelligence Service, MIS, which Chester's character actually enlists in. And some of those guys were actually put into the Pacific because they needed them to do translation. They needed them to interrogate prisoners. They were using them for some even some spying on the Japanese Empire. So it's thinking about what it must have been like to be someone in that position.
Yeah.
Knowing how delicate your life was hanging in the balance. You're surrounded by a group of American soldiers that are literally killing people that look like you on a daily basis and are being killed by them too, right?
Yeah.
And it's that kind of thing where, you can understand why someone might be distrustful then of somebody who's amongst their own ranks who looks like this enemy. And that's the kind of reality I think that Chester has begun to face in the later half of the season. So obviously, I haven't even seen the whole season yet because it's still airing, but it'll be interesting really to see how they trace his character throughout that journey.
It's crazy to see that and how they were just kind of like snuck around, like underneath and then just popping up till they figured out where they were going to put them.
It's like intentionally
crazy.
dehumanizing a group of people where, you saw that a lot in, like, as you say, it's not internment camps, it's concentration camps. In, like, the Holocaust, they did that all the time where they would separate families intentionally. They would they would take all of your items. They would, like, get rid of anything that reminded you of who you were before you were here to make that feel distant. And that, it was trying to erase who you were before so that other people had erased
also do
you.
that, yeah.
from society.
Part of that reason, too, I had referenced earlier about taking Buddhist leaders out of the community was to intentionally destabilize the Japanese American community. So a large part of that was anyone who could be identified as someone that would be a pillar within their community. Those were like the first people to go.
Yeah.
And I mean, the likelihood that one of those people might be a spy was extremely slim. In fact, in the entire duration of World War II, they didn't find a single shred of evidence that any Japanese Americans were plotting anything even remotely treasonous against the United States. But, it's interesting to kind of think about it. And I think how much of this is really being represented for the first time. Because, I can't stress enough how revolutionary it is to be able to watch these stories that I've grown up hearing from my elders in this community, on screen in primetime television. It's interesting that it's in the context of a horror show, and I think it makes sense for a lot of reasons that we've all been talking about here, but it's also kind of interesting that it couldn't happen before this or in a different genre. It wouldn't be able to stand alone. They kind of needed the horror element as a vehicle to get this pipelined into a mainstream platform so that other audiences would be willing to watch it, but also so that the industry itself could invest in it.
Yeah. And I think that's kind of there's two, I feel like, reasons for that I would say. One, I feel like with horror, we've said before, is kind of on the fringe, right? So it doesn't get as patrolled as the rest of the genres. So it does get away with a lot more. But I also think because specifically with this being about Japanese culture, that having it be horror makes sense in that America is so obsessed with Japanese horror and taking it and making it our own, however terrible it might be, in our version, right? But there is an obsession there, so it kind of is almost there's a good bridge that we would already we're already interested in that. So I think the next step would be we are interested in seeing that culture actually doing it and also seeing it in ways that I feel other foreign horror even isn't quite as digestible to American audiences as well as as much as it is with Japanese horror.
Yeah, and I think on that note, I know you guys did a whole episode on Japanese horror, but I brought this book with me here, which is Kaidan. This is the original collection of stories that Lafcadio Hearn took from oral histories when he was traveling through Japan in the mid to late 1800s. But 90% of the Japanese ghost stories that we know today that have been turned into Japanese horror films comes from this collection of short stories. So it's also kind of interesting to me because having grown up with some of these stories and then having done quite a bit of research on the film adaptation of the stories, 1964, Masaki Kobayashi's film, it was great to see so many of these things being integrated in a really authentic way into the terror.
Yeah.
And again, without going into too many specifics, the Yurei character meets all of the criteria of all of the Yurei that are talked about in the context of these stories. It's familiar to people who have seen things like Ringu, but it's clearly something that extends beyond that and has a direct, I think, genesis that comes from the Japanese folklore. So it's exciting to me to be able to see that stuff on American primetime television.
Yeah.
And it's one of those things where, in this case, I'm grateful to know that there are obviously Japanese and Japanese Americans who are consulting on this, and that's probably a good part of the reason why it's so accurate. But at the same time, even if it wasn't, and even if this was a show that had, very little impact on real conversations, I hope, fingers crossed, it does lead to more people having dialogues like this. But even if it doesn't, I think it'll give people a better sense of what an authentic Japanese horror is about versus the kind of tropes that we've seen recycled in the American versions of The Ring, Original, and The Grudge.
Yeah, and I guess I'm sure our listeners have listened to our J-horror episode, but if you haven't, do you mind telling our listeners about the Yurei and what they're about?
Yeah, so Yurei are kind of a class of ghosts, which are typically a vengeful female spirit, usually a person who was wronged by a man in their life as a human. Perhaps they were jilted by a lover. Maybe they were actually killed by their lover. Sometimes they've also been robbed of their child, either through childbirth or some other kind of malfeasance by a husband or a lover. And so this kind of spirit will take possession of people. Typically, only the person who's being haunted or tormented by the yurei can see them. Sometimes the attributes of shape-shifting are also attributed to them. So if you're watching The Terror, you'll hear most oftentimes they kind of switch between the word bakemono and yurei. And bakemono is kind of like a broader term for monster in general, but in the context that they're using it is also about a shapeshifter, right?
Okay.
So like bakemono or yurei like have the same kinds of attributes as we're seeing within the context of the show. And I think one of the more interesting things that they've started to do with Chester's storyline is to, you know, bring us into this point in his head where he's starting to question, is this real?
Yeah.
You know, because he's already out in the field. And again, I don't want to spoil too much, but he's starting to question, are these things actually happening because of a yurei or a bakemono? And like how much of the stuff that has tormented my family since Pearl Harbor is actually attributed to this kind of like evil spirit and the vengeance spirit.
Yeah.
Yeah, feelings. Yeah, I said feelings. Let's talk about feelings. Okay. And all that spooky stuff. I love spooky stuff.
Yeah, so if it's bad, it's that we spent 10 minutes, maybe more than that, trying to just think of a movie or show outside of The Terror that did East Asian representation well.
Or even just
or was there.
Or horror and bad.
Yes,
like
horror
we just don't get
'cause that's
a
what we do.
lot. And then if you like it, it's that therefore we need to keep doing this, right? We need to keep creating shows and having platforms for things like The Terror, so that becomes normal, so that we have stories where we can have more multifaceted characters, and they can be a villain, but it's not about race, and they can be a hero, and it's not about race, and they can just be a friend, and not like. And then there's also a protagonist who's also them. Like we can have more than one like minority on screen, and they can serve all different kinds of roles, and they don't have to fit these cliche things that we keep seeing and reoccurring. And the way that we do that is that we put pen and paper and we put film cameras and we put money into the pockets of the people who are creating these stories, who have the right to create these stories, right? And that's kind of like, I feel like what we see in the success of The Terror is that we do have people who have a right to the story, and even still, further than that, like, you know, got consulting from George Takei to make sure that they were getting all the facts right. How do you guys feel about East Asian representation?
Needs a lot of work.
Yes.
Yeah, it's just there's so many damaging things that like just media in general has now created for just lots of the population of the world.
Yeah.
But it's very specifically like East Asian and Asian communities that makes them appear on screen either as less human, less attractive, less
Yeah.
being the operative word, and that it's just really damaging as a human to grow up and have that be what you see as what's supposed to be a presentation of yourself.
On the other side too, right, there's this kind of idea that like Asians and particularly East Asians are this model minority that are somehow like closer to whiteness than other communities of color. And I mean, there's a lot of folks in our community who are really damaged by that too, right?
Yeah.
Because you pigeonhole somebody into this particular stereotype. We've got a lot of immigrants and also refugees who come from East Asian countries and Southeast Asian countries that do need support and need government assistance. And, you know, even something as simple as a kid who's in a really hard math class or chemistry class, they feel like they can't necessarily reach out to a peer or a teacher for help because they're Asian. They're supposed to get this, right?
Yeah.
So just finding ways to not overcorrect, but, at least get enough of a diversity in the representations because, we've got like scientists and researchers and doctors, but we've also got gangbangers and drug pushers and serial killers even, right? So like showing enough of all of these different things so that it really doesn't matter anymore, that you can have a film about like a Chinese American serial killer, like #1 serial killer, and that's not going to impact like the entire community, and then everybody thinks that all Chinese people are serial killers.
Yeah, because they also see heroes and they also see best friends, and what about, just quickly, we've already kind of talked about how much we love The Terror, but your rating of The Terror?
I think it's fantastic. As far as historical accuracy, the one thing that I need to point out is that it's not an actual camp that they're being put in. It resembles very closely the Minidoka camp, which was located in Idaho. But in the show, I believe they're located in Washington, and there were no camps in Washington state. Also, I'm not sure that it was a real assembly center that they used. Although there were many racetracks that were actually used. Santa Anita racetrack and the Tanforan Assembly Center was also a racetrack. So the bits that they talk about in terms of like the horse feces in the stalls, that was real.
Yeah.
And I've heard multiple accounts to that, attesting of that. But otherwise, it's a really well done show. For them to be able to cover as much of the history as they do in something like 8 episodes, it's insane. And I think it is a testament, again, to what you can do when you involve community in your storytelling. It's not that hard.
Yeah.
And it makes for a really compelling product.
Yeah.
And that, like, the idea that you can't sell such things to an audience of the United States it's not real. And we need to keep fighting because it's not real. And you can't tell us it's not real. That it's real.
Yeah.
You will see movies like Us. You will see movies like Get Out. You will see shows like The Terror on mainstream and popular media, and that's cool. Crazy Rich Asians.
Black Panther.
They sell tickets. People want to go see them. And all these white men need to go sit and go home.
You did it. You had your time.
Women want to make horror films, Bloom, whatever your name is.
Yes.
And I don't want to be loud, but I'll be loud if I got it. That's all I'm saying.
Yes. Nothing about us without us, which is such a great thing, which is exactly what this is. Thank you so much, Rob, for joining us. It's been super awesome. It was just what we dreamed and imagined, in that you're so knowledgeable, and I knew it. And we are really excited for what the future of representation in horror is going to be. I don't know if our little podcast is going to make waves. I hope it does. But for our listeners, if first off, again, for anyone who wants to get in touch with our guests, you can always email us at theghouls.nextdoor@gmail.com and just mention this is for Rob, and then we'll get you in touch with them, or we'll send it over. But if our people do want to reach out to you, where can we find you?
You can find me at www.paaff.org, facebook.com/PAF as well. We are actually getting ready for our 12th annual festival. So the dates this year are November 7th through the 17th. We've got 11 consecutive days of films, panels, discussions, workshops, concerts, theater performances, an academic conference, and a couple of different art installations. So really excited about that. And I'll actually shout out one title in particular that your listeners might be interested in.
Yes.
On Friday, November 8th at the Lightbox Film Center, we will be showing a Chinese mainland film called The Last Sunrise. Filmmakers are actually based here in New York City, and they went to film school here in the U.S., but they are born in mainland China. I would still consider them Asian American filmmakers, right? Because they're kind of between worlds in the respect that the diasporic experience distances you from your country of origin, even if you've only lived here for a decade. But in any case, fantastic film. It's about a group of people living in mainland China who are facing the reality of the sun burning out. Wow. And trying to figure out what they can do in the 72 hours or so that they have until the Earth's temperature at the surface level becomes inhospitable to life.
Yikes. weeks.
I should also mention, we always do a genre shorts program, and that'll actually be on the evening of Saturday, the 9th of November, also at Lightbox. But ever since I came on board as a film programmer at PAF, I've always tried to spotlight this genre, right?
Yeah.
And it's an exciting thing that we're able to offer completely free.
Yay!
Oh my gosh, it's free. I was
awesome.
about to like sidebar ask afterwards. I was like, how do we go?
Well, then attend it. You have no excuse now. You can come hang out with the Ghouls and Rob at the festival to see some really great films because this is the future. This is what we have. So again, thank you so much, Rob.
Thanks for having me.
This is awesome. So don't get married.
married.
Delete your kids.